What is going on in LA? Anti-immigration enforcement protests turned violent over the weekend, and so Trump sent in the National Guard and Marines to protect federal property and agents. So can he do that? And if he has that authority, do these riots justify him using it? This story, like every other story in today's political climate, has sorted people into their expected partisan reactionary boxes. But like everything else, there is nuance that you're simply probably not hearing if you're in a political echo chamber. So let's sort out what's going on. So first, the backstory. With a mandate to increase arrests, ICE agents were conducting raids in LA. They took detainees to Edward R. Roybal Federal Building and the nearby United States Courthouse, and soon, around 6 p.m. Friday evening, a crowd of protesters showed up to, protest these arrests. By 6:30 p.m., federal agents had requested support from local law enforcement because some protesters were damaging property and being violent towards federal agents. It's disputed how long it took LAPD to arrive. The federal government says it took 2 hours. LAPD says it took 40 minutes, and LA city officials say it was 55 minutes, which is a little weird because the LAPD headquarters is less than a 10-minute walk from this federal building. So I'm not really sure why it would even take 40 minutes, the minimum amount of time. By Saturday, things had escalated in an LA suburb of Paramount, where protesters thought that ICE agents were staging a raid on a Home Depot. But the DHS spokesperson says that they weren't, but were just staging at a nearby office that happened to be next to a Home Depot, but they had no plans to raid the Home Depot. Now, of course, the left is calling these mostly peaceful protests, which we've heard, of course, before. But they're ignoring the commercial fireworks being lobbed at police, the rocks being thrown onto the cars on the 101 freeway, the self-driving Waymos that are being set ablaze, which is especially hilarious because I guess these protesters couldn't find anything to burn around them, so they ordered a self-driving taxi so that they could set it on fire. And this is all happening with minimal arrest being made by the LAPD throughout Friday and Saturday. So Trump federalizes the National Guard, meaning he deployed them without the state's governor requesting the assistance, and he is in control of them as opposed to the governor. And 300 of them arrived Sunday morning with their orders to protect the federal property and employees. And Trump has ordered 4,000 National Guardsmen total to LA, although I'm not really sure why that's an appropriate number because this is not remotely the level of violence that we saw in 2020, where we didn't get that kind of response from Donald Trump. So let's talk about what makes this different than 2020 specifically. First of all, it is tiny comparatively. BJ Campbell at his hand-waving freakoutery Substack, which is one of my favorite names for a Substack ever, came up with a formula in 2020 to measure the violent protest that basically takes the number of demonstrators and protesters, the amount of property damage, number of deaths, number of arrests, and comes up with a quantifiable measurement of sorts. I mean, it's an arbitrary formula, but it's still a formula. He came up with this during the mostly peaceful 2020 protest, with my tongue firmly planted in my cheek. Those 2020 protests are the benchmark of sorts with a score of 100. These LA riots comparatively score a 0.2. So very, very small comparatively to the Black Lives Matter riots that we saw in 2020. Another key difference here is that most of the riots and protests in 2020 weren't on federal property or against federal law enforcement, and that makes a difference in what the president can respond to. There's a difference there because the federal government getting involved without the request of governors in local law enforcement would be highly problematic. If we allow the feds to swoop in anytime local law enforcement isn't doing enough, we would completely erode the standard of not using the military for civilian law enforcement, which is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. But the rioters attacked federal ICE agents, and they were preventing federal ICE agents from doing their job. And as we'll get to in a moment, local law enforcement basically did nothing to protect those federal agents. I think it's reasonable for the president to send other federal agents to back up those ICE agents. Though I think it seems obvious that Trump wants to use the military as opposed to the FBI or other federal agents because, he has a history of wanting to use the military as a show of strength. Trump had threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in his first term during the 2020 riots, but he never did so. He was talked off that ledge. But he was quoted calling his top defense personnel effing losers when they shot down his idea of having active duty troops shoot at demonstrators in 2020. Via his former chief of staff, John Kelly's conversations with New York Times, Mr. Kelly said that Mr. Trump was repeatedly told, dating back to his first year in office, why he should not use the U.S. military against Americans and the limits on his authority to do so. Mr. Trump nevertheless continued while in office to push the issue and claimed that he did have the authority to take such actions, Mr. Kelly said. This is obviously something that Trump is itching to do, and without anyone in his second administration willing to tell him no this time, enter California's stupid politicians. because California did drop the ball here. So you don't have to take sides. Gavin Newsom can be an untrustworthy politician. LA Mayor Karen Bass can be completely incompetent. And Trump can be an authoritarian bully. None of them are mutually exclusive. In fact, in some ways, they're all getting what they want and sort of feed off of each other. I don't know why we expect anything more from politicians, but to me, Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass are acting politically here. I'm absolutely a states' rights guy, but Newsom all of a sudden hiding behind the 10th Amendment makes me scared my eyes will get stuck if I'm rolling them so hard. But that's where we're at in politics today. You defend the enforcement of federal laws you like and say that enforcing the ones you don't is, illegitimate, I guess. You got to kind of think of it this way. Democrats can't be seen assisting immigration enforcement in any way because we've got to have open borders and all these things, their base believes. So what motivation would the mayor or governor have to send more state or local law enforcement to defend those ICE agents? I would say they have zero, and it's pretty obvious that they weren't willing to send other enforcement in. They were trying to pretend that this wasn't a violent problem. Throughout Friday and Saturday, they were basically saying there's not enough violence here to justify sending more law enforcement. Congresswoman Nanette Barragán from California, representing the district where the Paramount riots are happening, said this.
And I think that if ICE left, I think if the National Guard left, you would see this all die down.
I think I have it. Okay, so the problem is that we're trying to enforce laws. So if ICE just left California, the problem would be solved. So I guess we're not allowed to enforce laws, but I guess very selectively, because since Democrats are the open borders sort of no human is illegal party, they're just against enforcing immigration laws, but not, for example, climate change laws. So where's the line here? When do states get to supersede federal authority on this? The problem with Democrats is that they never will say that violence is bad without some sort of caveat to it. This is, for example, the statement we got from Senator Adam Schiff. Violence is never the answer. Assaulting law enforcement is never okay. Good so far. Indeed, doing so plays directly into the hands of those who seek to antagonize and weaponize the situation for their own gain. Don't let them succeed. So it's not that violence against law enforcement is bad per se. It's just bad in this situation because it helps Trump achieve his authoritarian goals. It's so ridiculous. Newsom and Bass tried to downplay the violence at first, but LAPD was contradicting their narrative early. LAPD said that they were being overwhelmed, though that doesn't mean that they need the National Guard and Marines necessarily, but it was obvious that this was a problem on the ground that Democrats were unwilling to say was happening. Mayor Bass, as recently as late Tuesday night, continued to lie about what started all of this by saying the Trump administration told us that they were going after violent criminals, gang members, and drug dealers, but they went after a Home Depot. Weird. I cannot imagine where the people of Los Angeles got the wrong idea that ICE caused this violent protest by raiding a Home Depot. Could it be that their elected officials continue to lie about the fact that ICE was going to a Home Depot at all? Although it should be noted, Home Depots are subject to federal law enforcement just like anything else. Jim Garrity at National Review Hilarious points out that it's not the Continental Hotel in the John Wick universe. I think there's a pretty obvious disconnect between California Democrats' words and their actions. They claimed throughout the weekend that law enforcement had the violence under control, that reinforcements were unnecessary and inflammatory, but then Bass is enforcing a curfew in some parts of downtown LA this week. So why would a curfew be necessary if the violence is under control? But let's get to Trump's bad actions. First of all, we have to ask, does he have the power to deploy the National Guard and the Marines? Again, I feel like a broken record saying, I'm not a constitutional lawyer for every one of these videos, but these things are in fact complicated. And as has been the case over and over again with the second Trump administration, it really does depend on the law. California is suing the Trump administration. It will no doubt make its way through the courts, and they will be the deciders of this. Unfortunately, the rioters may run out of Waymo cars that they can burn before the courts get around to it. But let's look at a little history, because the president federalizing National Guard without approval of the state's governor is not unprecedented. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson did so to protect the Selma marchers when Alabama Governor George Wallace refused to do so. They were both Democrats, by the way. It'd be great to see parties fighting with each other like that again. In 1957, Eisenhower did so similarly in Arkansas after the governor used the National Guard to prevent black students from entering Central High School after the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregation of schools was unconstitutional. Ike invoked the Insurrection Act, actually, and also sent the 101st Airborne Division of the Army to the school as well. Trump, however, has not invoked the Insurrection Act, so I'm not actually sure why he can have Marines on the ground in LA. I've not seen any legal explanation for that. But just to compare the two, in the 50s and 60s, some states disagreed with federal laws regarding segregation and didn't want to enforce them. The president then federalized the National Guard and used the military to make sure that federal law was followed. And now today, in 2025, we have California disagreeing with federal laws, this time of the immigration variety, and not only not enforcing those laws, but some rioters violently attacking the federal law enforcement attempting to do so, which has led the president to federalize the National Guard and send Marines in with the executive order to protect federal property and employees. This is not me saying that Trump is making the right call here. It's just that legally, when it gets to the courts, I think that he probably does have the power to send the National Guard in to protect federal property and agents. Though again, I do not see how the Marines need to be involved in this so far. The Trump administration is trying to enforce laws. Selectively, I will give you, and it should be no surprise that he wants to deport illegal immigrants because he campaigned on it explicitly. Yes, it does seem obvious that the Trump administration is more interested in doing this in a performative way. Ice Barbie comes to mind, or Dr. Phil going on ICE raids, than a results-oriented manner because he's promised to deport 1 million illegal immigrants in 1 year. And that was always a lofty goal because when you successfully shut the border down where most apprehensions and deportations take place under previous administrations, you have to find illegal immigrants where they live and work, which means you've got to go into cities, and that requires a lot of law enforcement and resources. It takes a lot of time. And we can have disagreements about what those immigration laws should be, but that does not entitle anyone to violently riot when someone tries to enforce those laws. Democrats are sort of stuck between a rock and a keffiyeh-clad hard place because honestly, I don't think the American public are likely to side with Mexican flag waving, property burning rioters raining down cinder block chunks on cars from overpasses and lighting self-driving cars on fire. Especially when they blamed the Biden and Harris administration for the flood of illegal immigrants into America during their time in the White House, and justifiably so. So how do Democrats signal to their base, we agree with you, while most American voters rejected those open border policies in 2024? I'm certainly glad that's not my problem to solve. How is this all going to end? It's cute that you think I would actually know. I don't. There are plenty of warning signs that Trump does, in fact, want this fight, that he may not want to use the military in foreign lands, but he's more than willing and maybe even excited about using it against enemies within the U.S. He's abusing his emergency powers given to him by Congress or the Constitution by labeling everything an emergency. It's an excuse for terrorists. It's an excuse for sending the National Guard into California. Every excuse is an emergency. Biden did this too, by the way, which is less of a problem that I have with Trump and more of a problem that I have with the fools who wrote those laws in such a broad way, clearly unimaginative in their assumptions about potential morals or lack thereof of future presidents. I cite Nick Cottagio at the Dispatch a lot, but he nailed it with his newsletter titled Trust No One. Not Newsom, not Mayor Bass, not Trump. In it, he asked, if what's happening in LA amounts to a rebellion so formidable that the president needs to deploy the National Guard to suppress it, what was he doing ringside at a UFC fight on Saturday night? George W. Bush wasn't at the movies the day after 9/11, was he? Like, invasion and emergency, rebellion is now a word devoid of all meaning except as an incantation to unlock some esoteric statutory authority Trump is craving. He's right. Going back to the hand-waving fregatery post, Campbell says the military being deployed for these LA riots, but not during 2020 by the same president, mind you, is evidence of kayfabe. Kayfabe is when professional wrestling builds a narrative of conflict for entertainment purposes. Campbell writes, it's clear in the mathematics that the relative size of a protest has no bearing on whether the National Guard gets activated. Oregon and Washington State in 2020 gained share in the attention economy by not using them. Walz in Minnesota would have caught local hell at the time for using it when it mattered, but caught hell later in the national election for not using it until it was too late. Trump didn't use Title X in Portland or Seattle in 2020 for the same reason he's using Title X now. Not using it then gave him ways to gain share of the attention economy, but using Title X now gains him share, and so forth. They're all just using the applause meter without any objective threshold for how and when to use or not use military riot control. And when you're a master of manipulating the attention economy by being a paid actor in a conflict, the applause meter is all that matters. Just listen to the crowd. These people we've elected are just not serious. Gavin Newsom's every word and action are weighed on what will help him run for president in 2028. And Trump's actions are equally selfish. Almost no one is putting the country ahead of personal ambition or scoring points for their team. This is expected when largely the American public, or at least the ones who vote in primaries, want this kind of red versus blue blood sport and are actively cheering it on. It's not going to end well.